Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now what I'd like to do today is do a roundup of the books I've been reading over the year 2025, my favourites and ones that have disappointed me. I'd like to start by just giving you a guide on how I read. I've always got 4 books going at any one time. I always have a literary book, a science fiction novel, a collection or anthology of ghostly or weird tales, and a non-fiction book. So what I'll do is I'll go through those 4 categories in order, and we'll look at what I've been reading in those categories. So I'm going to kick off with literature. Now at the moment I'm reading Lord Dunsany. I don't know if you've ever come across Lord Dunsany. He was an interesting character, sort of turn of the century. He was from Irish descent, but he grew up in England. And he was a bit of an aristocrat and sort of man about town, traveller. And he wrote these stories, which are often grouped together in weird tales with people like Lovecraft and Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Machen. But actually, what I've discovered is that's how I entered into the book. And at first I was a bit disappointed, because actually his stories are very different. They're much more folkloric. They're in the world of fairy tales, and mythology. And at first, that disappointed me. I wanted something more scary, more, atmospheric. And secondly, I thought, all his mythology is created. And I thought, what's the point of reading folklore and mythology that's created and is sort of saying the same myths and same ideas as real mythology and folklore? Why not just go back to that? But what I came to realise as I read more and more of it is that, first of all, he's a beautiful prose writer, and a very unusual prose writer for the British Isles, in that his prose is very precise, it's very clean and limpid, it's almost perfect. His fables, and they are fables, have that sort of circular beauty and perfection of a fable, Not some of the rough diamond writing that you associate with British writing, particularly like Dickens and so on. And what it reminded me of, and I sort of clicked into it and I started appreciating it, it reminded me of Borges, the Argentine writer who became one of the most influential writers of the 20th century. And this year I went back to reading Borges and this collection, the Aleph. Now, if you read the very first story of the Aleph, it's called The Immortal. It's pure Lord Dunsany. It's a fable like Homer goes to this ancient city of the immortal gods, which is completely empty, right? And it's this fable about creativity and time. And it's pure Lord Dunsany. Dunsany's fables are fables where the gods and men interact, and our relationship with the gods. And they have that kind of Borgian perfection. And I always, I knew that Borges was a fan of English literature and a follower of English literature. And he often named Lord Dunsany as one of his, people he liked. And I always thought it was just like a passion of his. But what I've realised is that Dunsany, who I thought was a minor, story writer, actually influenced Borges. When you read The Immortal and some of Borges' earlier stories, they are pure Lord Dunsany, right? They're philosophical fables, right? With this beautiful cut, clear, precise, abstract, sort of otherworldly, unhuman overview of the universe, the kind of omnipotent view. And I realised that Borges, who was such an important writer, was actually influenced by this relatively little-known British-Irish writer. Going back to Borges, I was fascinated by this. I've been fascinated by Borges and his compatriot Cortazar for years. And what I realised about Borges is that he was a huge influence on postmodernist writers because he takes writing into the abstract. Even when he talks about aspects of Argentinian life and life in Buenos Aires, he makes a sort of perfect, almost utopian prose, a utopian story which is often circular and circles back and becomes a sort of perfect fable on mankind. And there's a beautiful clarity and perfection. He's a real writer's writer, Borges, because you know how in the 60s all these philosophers like Barthes and Derrida and Foucault, who we'll talk about in a moment, they talked about everything is text. Well, when you read Borges, the world is text. Everything is language. His language, even in translation, is so perfect, it's so beautiful. That can make his stories seem a bit precious, I think. A bit sort of highfalutin. Nothing to do with the robustiousness of life. But if you just like the perfection of prose, being in this calm, clear space, Borges is strangely beautiful. Now this year, I talked about his compatriot Cortazar. Julio Cortazar, Argentine writer, wrote brilliant short stories. He wrote the original short story for Blow Up, the Antonioni film. And they're wonderful, mysterious tales where people transfer identities or find themselves moving between different realms. And I've been a fan of his since university. But this year, I went back to read one of those great big texts that we always feel we should read and we never get round to. And that is his major novel. It's called Rayuela in Spanish. It's known as Hopscotch in English. And it's a book that I've wanted to read for years because it has a very unique structure, right? Or at least this is what I thought. So it has a narrative that you can read straight, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. But then what Cortázar did, he gave you an alternative structure at the start of the book. He said you can skip around the chapters in this order. And it gives you a totally different book. Now that idea I thought was brilliant, right? So the book is different according to which order you read it in, and it has a different feel. In reality, it's a con. And I was very disappointed. The story is about this Argentinian writer in exile in Paris. And he has this love affair with this other Argentinian woman who's living in Paris. Then they split up, and he finds himself lost. And then he meets this other writer who's writing a book, which is similar to the one you're reading. It's got a different form. So it's a book about Parisian life and also about Argentinian exile. And it's full of that world of the Nouvelle Vague were in the early 60s in Paris. It was written in 63, of boho guys in garrets and attics, in free love, listening to jazz and all that sort of stuff. But the other aspect of it, the form, where you can go from different chapters, it's a con. All these other chapters are at the back of the book, and all they are is commentary. They're kind of extra diegetic. They're sort of meta, looking back and talking about how the novel is working, what it's trying to do. They don't really give you a different sense of a narrative. It's just like a sort of DVD extra to the narrative. So really you are reading the book in order, but just with extra bump. And that was a real disappointment to me. And to be honest, I gave up reading it. I was very disappointed. I'm not, when I was younger, I might have been impressed by the bohemian, sophisticated life of Parisians in the 1960s. I'm a bit too old for that kind of thing. And after a while, I rejected the book, sadly. Another writer that disappointed me this year, a writer that I've loved for many, many years. I've been planning to do a video on this channel for ages about the writers that define me. Not necessarily the best writers you've come across, but the writers who you would say are closest to you as a person, closest to your soul, right? And I always thought that one of them was William Golding. I read his books very early in my life. I read his first 3 novels, Lord of the Flies, The Inheritors and Pincher Martin, and I loved them. And I also read The Spire, and I loved that. And I was really fascinated by the power of Golding. There was this kind of almost elemental power in his writing which really shook me. So this year I went back to reading this, To the Ends of the Earth. This is regarded by many as his masterpiece. It's the 3 novels he wrote at the end of his life, and they're collected together in one volume. And they're all about a sea voyage in the early 1800s from England to Australia. And the main character is this young aristocrat who's sort of, he's in that sort of transition period between being boy and man, and how he gets on this voyage. And I've been longing to read this for years because I'm a huge fan of books of the sea. God, I was disappointed. I really struggled to get into it, and in the end I gave up. What it felt like a master writer, enjoying a jeu d'esprit and just having fun and playing at writing this great, maritime novel. It had none of the power of, say, Conrad, which I was looking for, really. It just felt like a bit of fun. I didn't get that sort of depth and profundity that I'd got from other William Golding novels, and I really missed it. And so I found that I was very disappointed with it. And in desperation, I went back and read his fourth novel, Freefall, because I thought maybe I like early Golding, Freefall is the first really personal novel that Golding writes, and I loved what it's about. It was written in the late 1950s. It's about this painter, and he's looking back at his life. And the question he's asking himself is this: what's the point where I stopped being a child and all the options of life were open to me and I cut down my freedom? What's that moment? Can you pinpoint a moment in your life when that open world of childhood and innocence, you make a conscious decision to stop that in a way, to bound yourself and become an adult? That's the idea of the book, which I think is quite interesting. And the strength of this book is in its early part, when he goes back and he looks at this working class childhood in Kent and his life during the war. Life leading up to the war as a child and as a teenager is quite brilliant. And, Golding goes to town in his very poetic language. He's almost writing sort of prose poetry, really. And I love the segment when he and his friend go into this church as a dare to spit on the altar. And the verger comes in and whacks him across the head and he sees stars. So he sort of sees enlightenment. And this is the moment that will change his life. That bit is beautifully written and strange. The problem with this book is the second half. If you've ever read it, the key point of the book, what you realise is that this guy is looking back on his life from the point of view of being a prisoner of war during the Second World War under the Nazis. And he's interrogated by this Nazi general, and then he's put in a cell. And the cell is in utter darkness and he doesn't know where he is. And Golding takes a long time going through the horror and the fear of this man in this cell. And it's supposed to be this great moment of primal terror of the human being. And frankly, it lost me. I just thought, mate, it's just a cell. You've just been banged up in a cell. And so this whole metaphor that Golding goes for lost me completely. I wasn't in the book. I was sort of trying to get through this endless scene with him in the cell. And the book just sort of stagnated from that point. Then he tries to go back to his teenager and two teachers, one representing science, one representing religion. And by that point, I just wasn't... This book just felt sort of studied to me. It felt schematic rather than actually bringing me into the emotion of it. So I've fallen out of love with William Golding. What to do? I wonder if anyone else out there is a Golding fan and has had problems with Golding or, questions about his style or his approach. I'd be interested to hear from you. One book, though, that was a shining highlight of this year was this. The biggest surprise I've had in my reading for quite a long time. It's called The Other Side, and it's by Alfred Kubin. If that name isn't very familiar, I don't blame you. He was actually, this is the only book he ever wrote. He was better known as an illustrator. He illustrated other people's books, and he illustrates his own book here, and that's one of the many things that reminds me of Moving Peaks Gormenghast, which I've done my own video on. This book has been produced by Daedalus Press. Now, if you've not come across Daedalus Press, they're really worth tracking down. What they're doing is, what they're interested in is weird tales and fantasy fiction from Europe, particularly from the Germanic nations, which hasn't been commonly available in Britain. And they're publishing it, and they're doing a brilliant job. There's some amazing books coming out from Daedalus Press. And this one is a gem. So it was Kubin's only book. Franz Kafka absolutely worshipped it, and many people admire this book, and you can see why. So the story of the book is this. It starts out in Munich, right, and it's towards the end of the 19th century. And there's this guy, and he's visited by this man who says, do you remember this person? He gives him this little locket sort of picture. This was an old school friend of yours, a rather eccentric, strange school friend. Well, this school friend wants you to come to Asia and join him, and he's building a dream state. He's building his own utopia. He's taking all sorts of elements and all sorts of people from around the world, mostly from Europe, and he's building this new country out in the plains of Asia. Now, the phrase dream state has a double meaning here. So on the one hand, he's building a utopia, hopefully a better world, but it's also a dream state where the currency is not money, it's not power, it's not the military, it's not the church. It's dreams, it's fantasies, it's desires, it's goals, and they are the only thing that matter. So this is a surreal novel. Right. And so you start off, this guy and his wife travel through Asia, and it's quite funny and it's quite low key. And then you get to this weird dream state, and you enter sort of Kafka mixed with Mervyn Peake. So they try to settle down in this place, but everything is influenced by dreams. So the currency is not stable. One minute someone is really rich, the next minute they're really poor. Weird stuff happens. There's ghosts. People, his own wife thinks, I'm going to die here, and she does die. And eventually the whole place crumbles into nightmare, literal nightmare. It's stunningly well written. It's very evocative. It's very surreal. It's disturbing. It's also darkly funny. And what it amounts to is it's a brilliant examination of consciousness versus unconsciousness. And it also is a sort of dark mirror portrait, an allegory of where Europe was at the time. And one of the figures who comes through, this kind of devil sort of saviour figure, is America. He's an American. And he wants to make it all about money, and he wants to organise it. But the forces of dream are against him. And it's kind of an allegory of where Europe was, and maybe is. Fascinating. I can't recommend this book highly enough. Quite brilliant. My best literary discovery in some time. Mind you, there is a writer who doesn't let you down. The Irish writer John Banville. I've spoken about him on this channel before. I think the greatest writer of our time. I found this book from the early 2000s, The Untouchable. This is one of the finest novels I've read in many a year. It's based on Anthony Blunt. Do you remember Anthony Blunt? He was one of those spies, Burgess, MacLean, Philby. They were part of an Oxbridge set in the 30s. They worked in the Secret Service during the war, and then they were double agents. They were giving secrets to the Soviets. And Blunt went on to become a famous art historian, and he worked for the Queen. He was in charge of the Queen's paintings, and then he got exposed. I don't know if you remember, there's that wonderful John Schlesinger, Alan Bennett TV play starring James Fox, A Question of Attribution, and this is a brilliant kind of complement to that. John Schlesinger also and Alan Bennett also made a wonderful play about Guy Burgess. The actress Coral Brown went to meet him in Moscow, and they did a play about it called An Englishman Abroad. If you've never seen it, get it out. It's fantastic. It's an endlessly interesting story to artists, this, about this group, this sophisticated, intelligent, educated group of Englishmen who all betrayed their country. And I think this novel is quite brilliant. The prose is stunning. The psychological acumen is fantastic. It's a great story. It's also a very, very clever portrait of intellectuals for whom politics, patriotism, these abstract ideas are something that they wear at arm's length, yet feel it defines them, and that makes them extremely dangerous. They don't really feel it. They're playing at it, but they're playing at it with, extreme importance. And that makes them very frightening and dangerous people. And I think that Banville captures that brilliantly in this book. Thing though, I've followed Banville's career avidly, and recently he turned to crime fiction. Right? Apparently he's been writing crime fiction for years and I didn't know about it. But I saw this book in Sainsbury's. It was £6.99, Snow. And I thought this was his first crime novel. And I was intrigued. Here's this great literary writer, and he's writing crime fiction. What would it be like? Now, you see, like the dumbass that I am, I thought that he'd be playing with crime fiction. He'd do something interesting with it. So I sat down to read this book. And it's a country house murder mystery. pure and simple. Someone actually dies in a library. A priest dies in a library. And then the police come and they start interviewing the suspects who are the family. And I'm sitting there thinking, it's going to change. It's going to get interesting. It's going to do something different. In fact, the book, for the first 100 pages, is so traditional and conventional, it's almost as though he's doing it on purpose. And after a while, I realised, actually, this is just a conventional crime book. He's just written, I'm fooling myself. I think he's going to do something really interesting. But actually, he's just writing a crime book because he feels like it. I felt very disappointed and very stupid. One last literary recommendation. Have you come across this book? A Journey Round My Room by Xavier the Maistre. I think I've pronounced that correctly. Now, this guy, he was an aristocrat and he was an officer in the French army around the time of 1790, so after the French Revolution. And he was in a duel. He got slightly wounded. And so he was sort of in he was in home arrest. He was sort of trapped in his home, right? So he wrote a book about it. He took the piss out of what was then becoming a fashionable type of fiction, which was travel fiction, people going around the world and having these adventures and talking about strange lands and cultures. So he did a piss take of this, where he just stays in one room and he goes around the room and saying what a wonderful journey it is in his mind to look over his things and remember the people associated with them and remember the times associated with them. And it builds up to a kind of personal philosophy. It's really, really entertaining. And I think it's a great book, actually. I think it's a lovely piece of domestic philosophy, intelligent, mature philosophy. And it's very jolly. It's lots of fun. All the time he's saying, what a wonderful thing this is to do, and what a wonderful room I've got, and what a wonderful life this is. It's such a tonic when compared to most other literature, which is quite heavy and sagacious, And this is the wit and wisdom of an ordinary man, looking clearly at the world around him. And then also in this volume, actually, there's a sequel. It was so popular that 20 years later he did another voyage around his room, which is equally entertaining and equally good fun. I can't recommend it highly enough.